We all remember the astonishing revelation only a bit more than 2 weeks ago that one of NASA's selected human moon landers for their Artemis moon program was a moon variant of SpaceX's Starship.
And there were really a lot of details hidden in the two renderings that were revealed. So many details, in fact, that we are now dedicating this entire episode to analyze the most interesting things about the moon version of Starship. So let's get started.
Very recently, we were presented these two new renders of a moon starship, which took many people by surprise. These two pictures are unfortunately all we were shown, but that's still enough, as they contain a lot of information. First, now we know how exactly Starship will land on the moon. Often we heard the criticism that Starship wouldn't be able to land on the moon. The argument being, the Raptor engines would shoot off the lunar regolith at such insane speeds that the debris would even reach lunar escape velocity. Thus, the lunar regolith wouldn't be able to support a Starship landing without a landing pad. Well, now we see here how SpaceX is trying to solve the problem. Namely, not the Raptor engines will be used to decelerate Starship onto the lunar surface, but some new type of thruster, possibly a variant of the SuperDraco thruster, which we know from the Crew Dragon. Initially, we assumed it would be some form of a cold gas thruster, but many insightful viewers of this channel rightfully pointed out that cold gas thrusters wouldn't be able to provide the needed thrust to land such a behemoth on the moon. So more likely it will be a modified version of the SuperDraco thrusters, or a smaller version of the Merlin engines.
Then, another highly fascinating detail we are seeing on the renders is the lack of any heat shielding. Now, this is extremely important, as this indicates that the moon Starship will never again land on Earth. Once in space, it will stay in space. The moon Starship would of course be launched by the Super Heavy into Earth orbit. Then the next crucial step in allowing large payloads of 100 metric tons or more to be carried to the surface of the moon is of course orbital refueling. This technology will be absolutely crucial for all of Starship's missions to the moon, but also to Mars. So once refueled, the Starship would then conduct the famous translunar injection burn, or TLI, meaning it would create thrust with its Raptor engines in order to leave Earth orbit and inject itself onto a trajectory towards the moon. Before reaching the moon, the spacecraft of course has to decelerate again using its Raptor engines in order to be able to inject itself into a stable moon orbit. After probably circling the moon a few times to carry out some scientific observations, the Starship would then further decelerate again using the Raptor engines, thus slowly descending towards the lunar surface. It would continue to use the Raptors until at some point, when it would be near enough to the surface, it would then switch to the upper thrusters that are shown here. It would continue using these thrusters to further decelerate. These engines will then direct the thrust of Starship carefully, such that Starship would tilt until it would be in a vertical position. Then the thrust would be relegated downwards, enabling Starship to land vertically.
We can also see the landing legs here, preparing for touchdown. After touchdown, the landing legs seem to retract, as shown on the second render here. So now that Starship has touched down, the crew is descending onto the surface via a lift. We assume that this previous render here, which we often have been shown, of a cargo Starship letting down a pressurized Artemis rover. We'll also see some changes. This one here is a crewed version of a moon Starship, but a cargo Starship would also have smaller thrusters mounted on the upside, same as the crew version. However, the difference would of course be the cargo Starship would need to be able to re-enter Earth's atmosphere, because it would have to bring cargo from Earth to the moon. Therefore, the overall design of the cargo moon Starship will probably remain similar to this one here, apart from the landing thrusters and the landing legs. Now the astronauts arriving with the white moon Starship would walk to the cargo Starship. and then they would descend the pressurized rovers from the cargo Starship onto the moon surface in order to have a much bigger exploration radius. These pressurized rovers could also serve as small mobile moon shelters, as they would allow a stay time on board of a couple of days. The cargo moon Starship would then depart again for Earth using its upper thrusters.
After the astronauts would have completed their mission, the moonship would lift off the moon again as in the landing sequence using its upper thrusters, not the Raptor engines, same as the cargo ship. Then, once the moon Starship is in moon orbit, it would initiate the Raptors for the Earth injection burn in order to leave the moon's gravity well back to Earth. Approaching Earth, the moon Starship would then decelerate exactly as when it approached the moon in order to enter Earth orbit. And now we understand why the moon Starship doesn't have a heat shielding. Namely because it will never land on Earth. It will remain in Earth orbit and be refueled again by a refueling Starship before the start of the next mission. The moonship could actually remain in orbit and serve as a space station because of its gigantic interior volume. After having been refueled by a fuel Starship, it would then be ready to receive the next crew. The crew would probably arrive via a Crew Dragon, which would dock to the moonship in orbit. A Dragon XL might be launched in addition and dock to the moonship for supply and cargo.
The next time Starship lands on the moon, some pressurized moon rovers would already be waiting from the previous mission. And maybe another cargo Starship would already have landed, delivering some Bigelow-like expandable habitat modules. The astronauts would descend the modules onto the surface. This process could be repeated and repeated again. Thus, more and more astronauts would be allowed to travel to the moon. First, maybe only 4 astronauts, then 8, then 20, and at some point, maybe even 100 people in one go when the moon colony has grown enough in size. But not so fast yet. Let's first analyze some other key features of this white moon Starship. So why the white paint actually? We saw the cargo version doesn't have a paint coating. Its steel surface is glittering in the sun. Our theory is that the cargo Starship wouldn't need to have life support systems and a stable inside temperature. However, the crude version of Starship has to provide an even temperature. Now we know that the temperature variations on the moon are pretty wild, from up to plus 127 degrees Celsius in the sun to minus 180 degrees Celsius in the shadow. That's a brutal difference. In order to minimize this variation, a coating with a very high reflectivity is very advisable, so that as much sunlight as possible is reflected, so the temperature differences could be somewhat reduced, and the sun-facing side of Starship doesn't heat up too much.
And then of course we have already briefly mentioned the solar array on the nose cone of the moonship. But why on the nose cone? Well, we know that the most interesting landing site for future astronauts will be near or at Shackleton crater at the lunar South Pole. Because there we have perpetual sunlight and also giant water ice reserves in the eternal shadows of Shackleton and the other surrounding craters. The sun is always on the horizon line, so there will be extremely long shadows. In order to minimize the risk of falling into a shadow, having the solar panels at 45 to 50 meters of height above the ground will be very beneficial, as it will increase the likelihood of receiving sunlight. Now, taking the formula for the surface of a cone and estimating the height of the solar array, we estimate that the surface area of the solar array is at least 70 square meters, half of which would always receive sunlight. Remember, the moon rotates once every 28 days, but at the South Pole, the sun would just wander round and round directly on the horizon line. Assuming an efficiency of 30% for the solar cells, we get 300 watts per square meter of power. So times 35 square meters which receive sunlight, this would yield 10.5 kilowatts of power generation from this quite small looking solar array. 10.5 kilowatts, that's not so bad from this quite inconspicuously looking solar array. So now that we know the exterior features of the moon Starship, what will exactly be its mission, its goal? Well, as we mentioned, it will be pretty easy to build quite large moon bases very fast using only a few of the white crew moonships and a few of the silver cargo moonships. One of those beasts can deliver 100 or more metric tons of cargo to the surface of the moon in one go. And since we know that Starship will be brutally cheap, thus be ready to fly immediately again after landing, without a lot of maintenance, we could imagine several crew and cargo moonships in continuous rotation from Earth to Moon and back. If NASA really will commit to Starship, which would be really awesome, an Artemis base camp would very quickly transform into Artemis Station and then Artemis City.
Starship is so transformative and so much cheaper than anything we ever had that it will be really easy to build large cities on the moon, to build huge radio telescopes on the far side of the moon, to build large mining facilities, and even to build large factories. Because if we really want to colonize the entire solar system and later other star systems, we should be extremely aware of one thing. The moon is the perfect starting point, because the gravity on the moon is so much lower. Therefore, giant spaceships built from moon resources and assembled in moon orbit could leave for distant destinations much easier than from Earth, requiring much less propellant. But this will be the topic of the next weeks and months, when we take a closer look at how exactly we could colonize the moon, and why the moon first, then Mars strategy would make a lot of sense. And we are also planning a collaboration with our good friend, the Angry Astronaut. It will be a series of 4 videos analyzing Elon's Mars colonization plans, and also potential joint Mars missions between SpaceX, NASA, and maybe other companies or space agencies. So we are really looking forward to this collaboration, and you should definitely check out his channel.
So do you agree with our moon first strategy that we should first colonize the moon and then afterwards Mars and other parts of the solar system?
And do you think that we have forgotten any key features of this new white Starship? Be sure to tell us in the comments.
So now we finished our Starship Flaw Fix series, the videos of which you can watch right here. And next we will talk about colonizing the moon and Mars.
And if they are already out, you can just click here. So thanks for watching, and I'd say, on to the future.
Jetzt, you want to say?
You can say it.
What Starship Flaw Fix series? What do you want to say?
And you can say... You want to say?
You can say, on to the future.
Yeah, good. So thanks for watching, and I'd say,